You're lying in bed, maybe wondering if marriage was ever simple. Let's drift somewhere quieter, to a world of candlelight, tightly laced corsets, and vows that sounded lovely, until you read the fine print. Tonight we explore Victorian marriage, a sacred institution wrapped in lace, powered by social climbing, and held together with silence, syphilis, and subtle desperation. The lamps are dim, the parlor smells faintly of lavender and resignation. Someone's about to propose, and someone else is about to lose her legal identity. Close your eyes, breathe in. You're about to become the perfect Victorian wife, whether you want to or not. And while you still have rights, go ahead and subscribe and tell me what century you're watching from. You're 17, which by Victorian standards means your childhood is over and your usefulness has officially begun. You've been trained for this moment since your first steps, walking quietly, sitting correctly, smiling without appearing too forward. Now, you stand in your family's drawing room, swaddled in a white gown you can't sit down in. Your mother has pinned an artificial rose to your bodice, and your father has poured himself another glass of brandy. He's not nervous. He's just hoping you fetch a husband with decent land and a surname that sounds expensive. Welcome to the marriage market. You are no longer a girl. You are now a debutante. And that means one thing. It's time to be paraded, evaluated, and hopefully selected like a prize turkey in a satin ribbon. The debutante season is open, and you're the merchandise. Across Victorian England, but especially in London, every spring was transformed into a glittering, grueling game of social matchmaking. This was the season, capital S. The time when noble families dusted off their country estates and migrated to the city to network, gossip, and, let's not pretend otherwise, marry off their daughters like very decorative financial investments. Your social debut is your big reveal. For months, you've been trained in etiquette, dance, and the fine art of pretending to listen to boring men with impressive surnames. Now, you're about to be formally presented to society and to Queen Victoria herself, if your family has enough clout. Your first stop? The drawing room at Buckingham Palace. That's where it happens. You'll wear white, always white, with 3 feathers in your hair and a dress with sleeves so enormous you could smuggle a governess under each arm. You'll curtsy deeply, gracefully, and without fainting. Ideally. This isn't a party. This is your launch. You are a debutante, and debutantes are both admired and judged in equal measure. What are they judging exactly? Oh, everything. Your skin should be pale but not sickly. Your waist should be tiny but not alarming. Your expression should be demure but not stupid. You should look like a porcelain doll with a mild opinion on Shakespeare. You should sparkle but not threaten. And above all, you must look available, but not too available. You are here to find a husband. But heaven forbid you look like you're trying. The stakes? Enormous. Marriage wasn't just a romantic goal. It was the goal, the one and only. If you were middle or upper class, your future was not about jobs or dreams. It was about securing the right match, a man with money, land, lineage, and hopefully teeth. That was your ticket to survival, security, and at best, respectability. At worst, to at least avoid ruin. Because the alternative? Spinsterdom. And no one wants that. Not in Victorian society. A spinster was a woman who had somehow failed at the one thing she was designed for: attracting a man and making babies in a timely fashion. She might live with her parents forever, or bounce between siblings, offering free childcare and unwelcome opinions. She might embroider. She might take up charity work. But mostly, she'd just fade into the wallpaper of society. Unmarried women were objects of pity, or worse, suspicion. What was wrong with her? Was she too opinionated? Too plain? Did she read too much? In the cruel economy of Victorian femininity, a woman's worth had a shelf life. If you were unmarried by 25, you were on the shelf. 28? Practically entombed. But you are still 17. You have time. You have hope. And critically, you have a white dress that makes your arms itch and your ribcage feel like it's in a decorative vice. You will now spend your nights attending dinners, balls, operas, and at-homes, polite little parties hosted by women who secretly hope you marry their cousin's son and move far, far away. Your days? A blur of fittings, flower arrangements, horse rides through Hyde Park, and intense whispered analysis of every eligible bachelor who so much as glances in your direction. Who is he? How much land does he own? Is his mother awful? Does he play cards or cheat at them? The questions never stop. Neither do the comparisons. There's always another girl with better teeth, a smaller waist, or an uncle in the House of Lords. There are rules, unspoken and brutal. You may smile at a man, but not too often. You may dance with him, but not more than twice in one evening. You must be seen, but not loud, admired, but not envied, present, but never forward. You are prey, performing confidence. And if you look tired, don't worry, everyone does. That's the point. This is a season of exhaustion disguised as glamour. Your shoes will pinch, your cheeks will ache, and your heart, well, best not to get too attached to that. Because Victorian marriage isn't about love. Not yet. It's about placement. About aligning families, securing inheritances, strengthening bloodlines, and ensuring that no one marries a poet or, heaven forbid, someone in trade. Love, if it shows up, is a bonus, like getting a decorative brooch with a pistol. Your value, unspoken but always felt, is calculated constantly. Dowry size? Good. Father's titles? Even better. Social charm, musical ability, and a delicate tolerance for boredom? Essential. You are being ranked, appraised, and sorted, not by dating apps, but by drawing room whispers and ball invitations. Your mother keeps a little notebook. It has names, titles, and shorthand notes. St. John, charming, flat feet. Mr. Redgrave, speaks too much, possibly Irish. Lord North, ideal, don't mess this up. And all the while, the clock ticks. Not a real one, a social one. Because every season that ends without a proposal brings you 1 year closer to being quietly ignored at garden parties and referred to as someone's companion. So tonight, you'll dance with Lord So-and-so, smile until your jaw locks, and pretend not to care when he turns to speak to the girl with the better gloves. You're 17. You're pretty. And if you don't marry within the next 3 years, society has made it clear you are doomed. But for now, enjoy the music. The string quartet is playing something slow, your hair is falling out of its pins, and someone just spilled sherry on the hem of your one good gown. Victorian romance. Isn't it magical? The curtain rises. The ballroom is gleaming. Candles flicker like nervous little conspirators. A pianist tinkles out a polite waltz in the corner, while teacups clink and everyone pretends they're not watching each other like hawks. Welcome to Victorian courtship, a delicately choreographed performance with a cast of thousands, an audience of everyone, and no intermission. If you thought courtship in this era involved heartfelt conversations and moonlit confessions, you're in the wrong century. This is romance conducted under surveillance, a soft-spoken interrogation where the stakes are lifelong and the costumes include gloves, fans, and your mother whispering behind a curtain. Every social event, every breakfast, opera, garden party, or charitable soiree is actually a stage. You're performing availability, virtue, and grace. He's performing stability, ambition, and ideally, decent posture. But here's the twist. You can't say what you mean. You can't even hint at it directly. So instead, you use tools, props, if you will. Accessories with secret double meanings. Let's start with the fan. It's not just a decorative way to waft the smell of other people's cologne away from your nose. It's your secret transmitter. Open it slowly, you're being watched. Tap it on your chin. I like you. Drop it deliberately. Let's meet. Snap it closed with flair. Goodbye forever, you idiot. A woman with a fan was essentially a 19th century spy, fluttering Morse code into the air while her aunt sat 5 feet away knitting judgment into a shawl. And it wasn't just fans. Gloves had their own language too. Putting them on slowly could indicate interest. Dropping a glove could signal flirtation. Putting on someone else's glove? That was like texting at 2 a.m. Even teacups weren't safe. The way you held the handle, stirred the sugar, even sipped, it all spoke volumes. If someone offered to refill your cup without asking, that was almost foreplay. Now none of this happened in private, because Victorian society had an allergy to privacy. You were never alone. You were never unobserved. You were never trusted. If you wanted to speak to a man, even casually, a third party had to be present, preferably an older female relative with the vigilance of a hawk and the subtlety of a cannonball. Chaperones weren't just a formality. They were the moral police, assigned like lifeguards at a pool, except their job was to stop you from emotionally drowning, or more specifically, from touching hands or showing affection of any kind. They were everywhere, hovering in gardens, loitering near punch bowls, pretending not to eavesdrop while audibly clearing their throats. They knew every trick, every fan flick, every glance, every time a gentleman offered you his arm for a stroll and you said yes a little too quickly. Ah, yes, the stroll. If you were lucky, very lucky, you might be invited on a garden walk, in broad daylight, on a pre-approved path, while your chaperone trailed behind at a distance she claimed was respectful. This was intimacy. This was your moment. You could talk, within reason, ask questions, laugh once or twice, softly, make eye contact, but not too long, never longer than a few seconds. You don't want to scandalize the hydrangeas. And if you shared a parasol, that was it. That was the romantic equivalent of slow dancing under the stars in other centuries. A parasol shared between two people who aren't married. Positively indecent, not illegal, but emotionally felonious. The real tragedy here is that none of this told you anything useful. You didn't know what kind of husband he'd be. You didn't know if he'd support your ideas, your reading habits, your strong opinions about garden design. You knew he liked your hair, that he danced well enough, that his mother once knew your cousin, that his waistcoat was fashionable and his estate, allegedly, had a view. You were not learning love. You were learning presentation under pressure, flirtation in a straitjacket. And all of it, every moment, was observed. Even letters, the ones supposed to escape, were subject to surveillance. If a man wished to write to you, it had to go through the proper channels. Letters were often read by your mother or your governess, or in some unfortunate cases, your older brother with a superiority complex, and very little else to do. Worse, if your suitor was too poetic or too forward, the correspondence might be quietly returned, unopened. Your heart, it turns out, needed a return address and a proper stamp. But within all this formality, something interesting happens. People still fell for each other, despite the rules, despite the rituals, despite the tea, fans, gloves, and judgmental widows in the corner. People still smiled when they weren't supposed to, still looked too long, still brushed fingers when passing a music program, still found tiny gaps in the curtain and used them. Because even when courtship becomes theater, some performances go off script. So here you are, rehearsing your lines, adjusting your posture, and wondering if that man with the strong jaw and questionable handwriting might be the one to dance with you a third time. Which, as you know, means everyone will assume you're secretly engaged. And maybe you are. Or maybe you just needed someone to pass you the sugar. So, he's finally kneeling. There's a small box in his hand. His cravat is slightly crooked, and his voice is trembling, either from emotion or indigestion. And you? You're smiling. Your mother is weeping discreetly in the background. Your father is pretending not to count the carats on the ring. It looks romantic. It feels romantic. But make no mistake, this is a transaction. This is a proposal, yes. But it is also, and very clearly, a contract negotiation, lightly disguised as affection and florals. In the Victorian world, a marriage proposal wasn't simply, "I love you." It was, "I have assessed your dowry, and I accept your terms. My estate is financially viable, and your family name is socially acceptable. Let's merge." Of course, no one said it quite like that. They said things like, "I cannot imagine life without you. Your virtues have utterly captured my heart. Your eyes are like the Devonshire coast at sunrise." But what they meant was, "Your father owns 3 mills. You come with $5,000 in railway shares. You won't embarrass me at dinner parties." The proposal moment was often rehearsed, and sometimes not even made to the woman herself. If your family was traditional, and in Victorian England most were, your suitor likely approached your father first. He would explain his intentions, list his assets, and, with luck, present a solid marriage settlement, a formal document outlining the financial terms of the union. You, the future bride, you might be informed later, ideally over tea. Think of it like a real estate agent selling your future. Only you're the property. And then there's the engagement ring. Diamonds were becoming popular by the mid to late 1800s, especially after large deposits were found in South Africa. A diamond ring wasn't just pretty, it was a signal. I can afford to claim you. This hand now belongs to someone. Please start practicing your signature with my last name. In reality, the ring functioned as a kind of down payment, not just for the bride's hand, but her time, her work, her womb, and her social obedience. This sparkly little circle locked in a promise that you would now cook, clean, host, smile, and bear children, ideally sons, while being charming but never loud, beautiful but never vain, and clever but never publicly so. Romantic. The marriage settlement was the real jewel of the engagement process. Think of it as a prenup written in florid 19th century legalese. It spelled out how much dowry the bride brought, what kind of annual allowance she'd receive, if any, what happened to her property, spoiler, it transferred to him, and what provisions were made for her if he died, a widow's jointure, if she was lucky. All of this was negotiated between men, your father, your future husband, and perhaps his solicitor. You weren't expected to attend the meeting, or understand the terms, or speak. After all, you were already getting the ring. This system wasn't about cynicism, at least not overtly. It was about security. For women, whose legal rights were limited, whose employment options were laughable, and whose public status was tied to respectability, marriage was survival. A wealthy, stable husband wasn't just a romantic ideal. He was your only insurance policy. If your husband died, the settlement might protect you. If he left you, you had no rights, but at least you had a clause. If he beat you, cheated, disappeared, or gambled the furniture away, well, hopefully your father had included a generous clause for incidentals, like dignity. And once the settlement was signed, the ring admired, and your name stitched into linen by a cousin you didn't particularly like, the engagement could begin. Engagements weren't always long. 6 months was typical. During this time, couples might exchange letters, visit each other's families, and pose awkwardly for portraits they secretly hated. Affection was allowed, in moderation. Public displays were still frowned upon, but you might be permitted to speak freely. You might even, daringly, hold hands. Though not for too long. Someone's aunt is always watching. Now, all this might sound very impersonal, but not every Victorian engagement was ice-cold accounting. Some couples were genuinely fond of one another. Some even fell in love. But even then, even when emotions ran high and feelings were sincere, they were still operating within a system that translated affection into financial obligation. You weren't just pledging your heart. You were agreeing to transfer your legal identity, relocate your body, and perform unpaid domestic labor indefinitely. To marry was quite literally to merge. Your name would change. Your signature would change. Your legal rights would shrink. You would, in the eyes of the law, become one person. And that person would be your husband. Some women looked forward to it. Some dreaded it. Some didn't have a choice. But all of them knew. The moment he proposed, it wasn't just a question of love. It was a question of property, power, and permanence. Because in Victorian England, a proposal wasn't just a promise. It was a contract, and the terms were rarely in your favor. It's your wedding day. Your corset is so tight you haven't taken a proper breath since sunrise. The flowers are wilting in the summer heat. The officiating vicar is running 20 minutes late, and your mother has asked, sweetly, if you absolutely must look so pale in the photos. But everything's going to plan. The horse-drawn carriages have arrived. The servants are polishing the last of the silver. And outside the chapel, the guests are lined up like fashionably dressed witnesses to your emotional resignation. Welcome to Victorian wedding season, a glorious parade of silk, spectacle, and suppressed panic. Now, weddings in earlier centuries could be quiet affairs, private, practical, and often done with minimal fuss, but not in Victorian England. By the mid-1800s, weddings had become lavish public performances, designed to signal one very important thing. We are respectable. We are successful. We are doing this correctly. And who do we have to thank for this shift? Queen Victoria, of course. In 1840, Victoria married Prince Albert in a simple white silk gown with orange blossom accents, and it caused a fashion earthquake. White, previously worn mostly by those with laundry staff and a death wish, suddenly became the color of purity. And if the queen wore it, you wore it too. Never mind that white wasn't exactly practical, or flattering, or warm. It was regal. It was bridal. It was now mandatory. And it wasn't just the dress. Everything about a Victorian wedding was designed to signal social status, from the calligraphy on the invitations to the cut of the cake. Weddings were no longer just about uniting two people. They were about uniting two families, two fortunes, and two very curated public reputations. The guest list was strategic. The venue was political. The menu was scrutinized. You didn't just get married, you hosted a marriage. And if your family was wealthy enough, your reception might include champagne towers, string quartets, gift tables piled with silver spoons you'll never use, and at least one cousin pretending not to be disappointed he wasn't invited to the bachelor party. But for all the spectacle, let's be very clear. Weddings were not emotional free-for-alls. You weren't expected to cry, laugh, or swoon. You were expected to stand still, look serene, and recite your vows like someone who just read them for the first time and decided not to ask any follow-up questions. Affection was allowed, but only if it was silent, brief, and photogenic. A discreet hand squeeze, a closed-mouth smile, possibly a forehead kiss if you were feeling rebellious. Anything more? Indecent. There were clergymen present, and your grandmother. And of course, the wedding wasn't really about you, was it? It was about the performance, the presentation, the statement. This was your family's grand reveal, their daughter, successfully placed. All the training, dowries, and dinner parties had led to this moment. You were the end product of years of planning, a human centerpiece, the physical embodiment of taste, legacy, and parental negotiation. And you were expected to perform beautifully. There were social pitfalls everywhere. Invite too few people, and you're seen as cold. Invite too many, and you look desperate. Choose the wrong fabric for your veil? Scandal. Hire the wrong organist? Whispers for weeks. And if your groom had the misfortune of being from new money, you could practically hear the pearl-clutching echo across the county, because Victorian society wasn't just about wealth. It was about origin stories, ancestry, breeding, land. Where your money came from mattered more than how much of it you had. Weddings were where those unspoken judgments came out, in the seating arrangements, the side-eye glances, the sudden interest in your cousin's matchmaking prospects. The ceremony itself was usually held in a church, conducted with stiff decorum and about as much emotional warmth as a tax audit. Vows were standardized. No personalized poetry or love letters read aloud. You were marrying into a script, not writing one. The bride was often given away by her father, because nothing says lifelong partnership quite like being handed over like a well-trained retriever. You promised to obey, honor, and occasionally be spoken to, while wearing gloves, of course. And then came the part where you were declared wife and husband. No, not husband and wife. That would imply equality. The reception was a blur of toasts, tiny sandwiches, and awkward mingling. You might dance. Once. Very gently, while your aunt comments loudly on how your husband doesn't look quite as handsome as he did in the engagement portrait. There would be cake, elaborately tiered, excessively iced, and rarely eaten. There might be gifts, mostly household items you didn't choose and wouldn't use, and then, eventually, the carriage would arrive. Because the final act of the Victorian wedding was not the kiss, it was the departure. The bride and groom would climb into a decorated carriage, wave like minor royalty, and vanish into their new life. one forged in lace, law, and long-term performance. So yes, your wedding was beautiful. Your train was 12 feet long. Your gloves were hand-stitched by a Belgian artisan with trembling fingers. But underneath the ribbons and respectability, you were now officially someone else's property. Signed, sealed, and socially approved. Hope you perform well. Congratulations. You're married. The guests have gone home. The cake is still drying out in the kitchen. Your husband has called you "my dear" 3 times in 1 hour, and already started referring to the drawing room as his study. But here's the bigger news. You no longer exist. At least, not legally. Welcome to the fascinating, horrifying world of coverture, the Victorian legal doctrine that gently, politely, and with impeccable handwriting erased married women from the law books. Let's break it down. Under coverture, when a woman married a man, they became one legal person, which sounds poetic, spiritual even, until you realize that one person meant him. Your identity didn't merge with his, it evaporated into his. You lost your surname, your rights, your ability to own property, sign contracts, or keep your own earnings. You couldn't sue or be sued. You had no legal standing in your own home, your own body, or your own life. Essentially, single women were individuals. Married women were shadows with good posture. This wasn't a bureaucratic oversight. This was the system. Victorian lawmakers, mostly men who had never done their own laundry, genuinely believed this was efficient, logical, biblical. After all, the husband was the head of the household. He provided, he protected, he made the decisions. And in return, the wife obeyed, decorated the parlor, and kept the tea warm. She didn't need legal autonomy. What could she possibly want to do? Own land, vote, have a checking account. Don't be absurd. So what did this look like in practice? Let's say you were a middle-class woman with a small inheritance from your aunt. Before marriage, it was yours. After marriage, it was his. He could spend it, invest it, or lose it in a card game. You had no say. Or say you were a writer. You published under your own name. Your husband could collect the royalties, sign the contracts, and even have your works published without your knowledge. You were the talent. He was the legal entity, romantic. But the real horror began when marriage turned sour. Which brings us to one of the most tragic and illuminating cases of the Victorian era. Caroline Norton. Caroline was a poet, a writer, and a sharp, politically minded woman married to an absolute monster of a man named George Norton, a minor MP with a fragile ego and a tendency to hit things, including her. Caroline endured years of physical abuse and psychological torment. She eventually separated from George, hoping to find peace and safety. But here's the problem. Under coverture, George still controlled everything. He took their children. She had no rights to see them, because legally they weren't hers. He stole her earnings. She had published books and articles under her own name, but he claimed every penny because she had no legal personhood. And then, when she began campaigning for legal reform, he accused her of having an affair with the Prime Minister, publicly, in court. The case exploded in the press. Caroline Norton, already humiliated, isolated, and broke, was forced to defend her reputation in front of a jury that considered her mere existence controversial. The affair? Almost certainly false. The damage? Lifelong. But Caroline didn't fold. She wrote pamphlets, letters, articles. She exposed the absurd cruelty of the laws that had crushed her. And because she was articulate, relentless, and impossible to ignore, Parliament eventually listened. Her work helped inspire the Custody of Infants Act, 1839, and the Married Women's Property Acts, 1870 and 1882, early steps toward dismantling coverture. Not perfect, not fast, but something. Still, for most Victorian women, the reality remained brutal. Marriage meant disappearance, not just from courtrooms, but from your own bank account, your own children, your own future. Even your clothes could be legally claimed by your husband if he felt especially petty. And if you left him, without his permission, you could be arrested for desertion. You'd be brought back, often by force, and expected to behave. Now, some families tried to work around the system. Wealthy fathers might insert clauses into marriage settlements, allowing their daughters to keep certain properties or control small trusts. But even those protections could be weak, and often depended on your husband's willingness to honor them. If he ignored the terms, good luck taking him to court. Remember, you can't sue him, because according to the law, you are him, and suing yourself would be both pointless and exhausting. This legal vanishing act didn't just affect finances. It affected safety, freedom, dignity. Women trapped in abusive marriages had no recourse, no resources, no rights to their children, no protection from the man legally considered their guardian. They were expected to endure, quietly, graciously, at all costs, and society, of course, applauded their resilience, while quietly blaming them for marrying poorly. So if you've ever wondered why Victorian women wrote so many emotional novels, angry diaries, and letters hidden under floorboards, this is why. Because they were living ghost stories, trapped in homes they couldn't leave, wearing names they didn't choose, speaking softly in rooms where their voices didn't count. You may have said, "I do," but the law said, "You don't. You don't matter. You don't own. You don't exist. But don't worry. You're married, and you should be grateful." Congratulations again. You survived the wedding. You've adjusted to your new legal status, that of a pleasant legal figment. You've hung your bonnet by the door, unpacked your embroidery silks, and now comes the real work. No, not a job. Don't be silly. Your life is the job. Because being a Victorian wife isn't about relaxing into a life of luxury. It's about becoming the unpaid CEO of a very demanding, very judgmental household enterprise. One that comes with no salary, no holidays, and a performance review every time the mutton is slightly dry. Let's start with the obvious. If you're middle or upper class, you don't scrub floors or boil laundry yourself. You have staff for that. A small army of maids, cooks, scullery girls, and, if you're unlucky, a footman who's far too handsome and knows it. But make no mistake, you manage them. You are the general, the overseer, the domestic strategist. Your day begins early, not with yoga or journaling, but with a stiff-backed march through the house to inspect the fires, the breakfast trays, and the state of the guest towels. You must plan the day's meals, the evening's company, the seating arrangements, the tableware, the flowers, the tone, the weather, the mood. You must ensure the soup is served hot but not scalding. The mutton must arrive pink but not blushing. The cutlery must be perfectly aligned, and the dessert should neither wobble too much nor offend the rector's delicate digestion. And that's just Wednesday. You oversee the household accounts, but you don't control the money. That's your husband's department. He signs the checks. You simply stretch them. You track spending. You negotiate with grocers. You settle petty disputes between the upstairs maid and the cook, both of whom hate each other but are too polite to say so in front of the silver. You're also in charge of decor. If a visitor walks in and sees a wilted bouquet or an out-of-date carpet, you will be blamed. Not the footman, not the gardener, you. Because the home reflects the wife. Is it warm? Is it refined? Does it smell faintly of lavender and superiority? Then you're doing fine. And of course, you run the social calendar. You must remember everyone's birthday, favorite biscuit, and moral failing. You send cards, you schedule calls, you plan dinner parties with cutthroat precision, seating enemies at opposite ends of the table and making sure nobody is served pigeon twice in 1 week. You must entertain without overstepping, charm without being too clever. And God help you if your mother-in-law visits and the tea is slightly oversteeped. Now, one might imagine that a woman performing this much labor would be admired, respected, consulted even. But no, your opinions on politics, economics, the arts, your husband's haircut, are generally optional or dangerous. Your allowed preferences, sure. You may prefer lilies to roses, or syllabub to trifle. But real opinions? Those must be folded discreetly between napkin rings and never shared too loudly in mixed company. You can read, but not too much. You can express yourself, but not too freely. You can have thoughts, just don't let them interfere with the veal. Your husband, meanwhile, expects comfort, stability, roast lamb on Sundays, and very little resistance. His slippers should appear at the same time each night. His shirts should be properly starched. His roast should be perfect, and your mood should be cheerful but not intrusive. If he wants quiet, you provide it. If he wants guests, you host them. If he wants to explain the Crimean War to you for the 4th time while you're trying to balance the books and stop the baby from eating coal, you smile, nod, perhaps faint slightly if all else fails. And through all this, you must appear effortless. You must glide through your home like a swan, graceful above the surface, paddling madly beneath. You must look composed, well-groomed, and slightly ethereal. You must never look tired. Tiredness implies weakness, or worse, dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction is ungrateful. Ungrateful women get talked about, or worse, pitied. So you perform, you host, you pour. You write thank you notes to people you despise and make polite conversation about curtains while your brain silently begs for stimulation. You are competent, you are kind, you are exhausted, and no one notices unless something goes wrong. Because here's the trick. If everything runs smoothly, no one thanks you. They assume it's natural, but if a dish is cold, or a child sneezes, or the lace on your cuff is last season, then the whispers begin. She seems a little overwhelmed. Perhaps she was more decorative than domestic. Well, her mother never quite managed either. Domestic life in the Victorian era wasn't idle luxury. It was a constant performance of grace under invisible pressure. You weren't lounging on a chaise, eating bonbons and swooning for fun. You were running a household empire with no title, no pay, and a job description that somehow included event planner, HR manager, nurse interior decorator, etiquette expert, emotional support sponge, all wrapped in taffeta. And if you cracked, even for a moment, there were always fainting couches and people ready to say you were delicate. So yes, marriage gave you a home, but it also gave you a job, one you didn't apply for, can't resign from, and will never be promoted in. Welcome to domestic bliss. Now get the lamb in the oven. The house is quiet. The candles have been blown out. The corset is off. Finally. Your hair has been brushed 100 times, your prayers have been mumbled, and now you're standing awkwardly beside a canopied bed covered in monogrammed linens and generational expectation. Welcome to the Victorian marital night, or as many women would come to remember it, the night of mysterious discomfort, confused breathing, and absolutely no explanation. Let's be clear. Most Victorian women entered marriage with zero understanding of what sex actually was. There were no health classes, no helpful diagrams, and certainly no aunt who sat you down to explain things using a peach. If you were lucky, your mother might mention something vague and terrifying about your wifely duty. If you were unlucky, she'd hand you a lace nightgown and a bottle of lavender water and tell you to relax. And then, that was it. Straight from embroidery samplers to anatomical chaos, without so much as a pamphlet. The first night of married life was often a blend of confusion, pressure, and physical shock. You were expected to endure it gracefully. Cry if you must, but quietly. No one wanted to hear about it. Not your mother, not your friends, not even your new husband, who might be equally clueless or disturbingly confident, depending on how many professional visits he'd had prior to the ceremony. Yes, let's talk about him. Victorian husbands came in a few varieties. The inexperienced but nervous, who treated your body like a scientific experiment and apologized constantly. The experienced and smug, who brought bedroom techniques he picked up at brothels and expected you to thank him for it. And the utterly indifferent, who simply did what they believed needed doing and then rolled over and went to sleep. None of these were particularly romantic, but all of them came with the same general expectation that you would comply, conceive, and not complain. And here's the truly charming part. Victorian medicine did not believe women experienced sexual pleasure. In fact, most doctors insisted that if you did enjoy it, there was probably something wrong with you. You were hysterical, overstimulated, perhaps in need of a cold bath or a firm talking to. Female desire was considered unladylike at best and deviant at worst. You were expected to lie back, not in ecstasy, but in duty, silent, still, preferably with eyes closed and thoughts on empire. Many women found the experience painful, or frightening, or just incredibly awkward. There were no conversations about consent, no words for discomfort, no cultural space for saying, "Actually, I'd rather just cuddle and read Dickens." You couldn't say no. Not really. Marital rape was not recognized as a crime, because legally, your body belonged to him. He could access it whenever he wished. That was part of the deal, part of the vows. You said, "I do," and the law interpreted it as permanent permission. Even worse, there was a very real chance you'd be infected with something he picked up before the wedding, or continued picking up after. Syphilis, gonorrhea, other delightful gifts brought home from gentlemen's clubs and visits to ladies of the evening. It was disturbingly common. Men had affairs, they had mistresses, they visited sex workers. It was expected, discreetly, and largely ignored. Boys would be boys, after all. But when they brought disease home to their wives, that too was quietly tolerated. Some women went blind. Others miscarried repeatedly. Many suffered chronic pain and shame for something they never understood and couldn't even name. And still, no one talked about it. Victorian society was obsessed with appearances, the image of a proper marriage, the performance of intimacy. What happened behind closed doors was private, even when it was miserable, even when it was harmful. You smiled, you hosted, you wrote polite letters and wore high collars and tried not to flinch when your husband reached for your hand. You were a wife. You were not supposed to want more, or less, or anything different. And so, the bedroom became its own quiet battlefield, a place where silence reigned, where your body was both central and invisible, where expectations were high, knowledge was low, and agency was non-existent. Some couples managed, some found closeness, even affection, but many didn't. Many lived in years of quiet confusion, of disconnection, of shame they couldn't name, and all of them, every wife, was expected to pretend it was fine, to light the lamps, to change the sheets, to look radiant at breakfast the next morning and say, "I'm simply glowing." So here you are, wearing lace that itches, smiling at a man who may or may not understand you, lying in a bed that is yours in name, but never in power, and you wonder, as the candle flickers low, whether this is intimacy or just another part of the performance. So, you've lit the fire, folded the linens, endured a marriage ceremony, a legal disappearance, a rather uninspiring introduction to intimacy. And now, just as you're adjusting to your new role as decorative house manager with no opinions, your husband brings home a little something extra, a surprise, a token, a medically uninvited guest. Welcome to the unspoken reality of Victorian venereal disease, where brothels were bustling, husbands were discreetly reckless, and wives paid the price, quietly, painfully, and without recourse. Let's begin with the hypocrisy. Victorian society considered female chastity sacred. A virtuous woman was modest, moral, and unquestionably monogamous. Men, not so much. Prostitution was not only tolerated, it was quietly considered a male necessity. After all, men would be men. They had needs. Better they visit a brothel than tempt respectable women, or worse, marry without getting it out of their system. So brothels flourished. In London alone, by mid-century, there were thousands, some discreet, some opulent, some absolutely appalling. The women inside, often poor, orphaned, tricked, or trafficked. Many were underage. Many were addicted, abused, or discarded the moment they became ill or pregnant. No one spoke of them in polite company, but they existed on the margins of every respectable man's life. The shadow to his gentleman's club, the companion to his cigar, the footnote to his bachelor days. And when he married, he didn't always stop visiting, because marital sex was for reproduction, not pleasure. It was duty. It was routine. It didn't satisfy in the same way, and so many men continued to frequent brothels, even after saying, "I do," and often without precautions, because those were considered vulgar, or unnecessary, or in some cases, emasculating, which brings us to the consequences. The diseases, syphilis, gonorrhea, and their charming friends, spread like whispered scandal behind velvet curtains. Symptoms were often ignored until it was too late. And when these men brought infections home to their wives, as they frequently did, the fallout was devastating. Wives developed ulcers, fevers, neurological symptoms. Many miscarried repeatedly, or delivered stillborn babies. Some passed infections to their newborns, whose tiny bodies couldn't survive the burden. Children died, mothers suffered, and still, no one talked about it, because to speak was to accuse. To accuse your husband of visiting a brothel was to accuse yourself of failing him, of being cold, frigid, or insufficient. Doctors, when consulted, were often complicit in the silence. Some gently blamed a change in climate or nervous conditions. Others quietly prescribed mercury-based treatments that were almost as lethal as the disease itself. Yes, mercury. The cure was often poison, blistering salves, internal douches, and injections that felt like medieval punishments more than remedies. Some women were treated in secret. Others were sent to asylums when the neurological damage from untreated syphilis set in, mistaken for madness, written off as female hysteria. And who was blamed? Not the men. The women. Always the women. The prostitutes were seen as dirty. The wives were seen as weak. But the men, they were just, what? Careless romantics? Their behavior was excused with phrases like, boys will be boys. He has a taste for adventure. She drove him to it. No one dared suggest a respectable man might be a walking infection. That would be rude. Better to pretend the wife had female trouble and leave it at that. The government's response? In true Victorian fashion, selectively brutal. In 1864, Britain passed the Contagious Diseases Acts, laws that allowed police to forcibly examine and detain suspected sex workers for infection. No warrant, no charge, just suspicion. If found diseased, women could be imprisoned in lock hospitals for months. No treatment for the men who infected them. No testing of the soldiers, clerks, or doctors who visited them. Only the women were punished. Because women were the danger. Men were just victims of their own appetites. And what about the wives? There were no protections. There were no support groups, no therapists, no pamphlets explaining symptoms, no legal grounds for divorce in most cases, unless you could prove violence or adultery with witnesses. Even then, you risked social ruin, so you stayed. You hid your pain. You lost pregnancies and told people it was the weather. You developed sores and said it was eczema. You watched your children fade and told yourself it was God's will, because speaking the truth meant admitting the lie. And the lie was that your marriage was respectable. Not all men were guilty. Not all women were victims. But the system was stacked in favor of silence. Respectable society didn't want to acknowledge what was festering beneath the veneer of lace and propriety. They wanted polished parlors, trimmed hedges, and radiant wives with fresh cheeks and no questions. They wanted perfect family portraits, even if someone in the frame was dying slowly from a disease no one dared name. So the brothels stayed open. The doctors stayed quiet. The children were buried without explanations. And the wives? They endured. Because that's what they were told good women do. The curtains are drawn. The fire's low. Dinner is cleared. The neighbors think you're doing fine. You smiled at the grocer. You said thank you at church. The silver is polished. The children are quiet. From the outside, everything looks perfect. From the inside, you flinch when the door opens. In Victorian England, the home was called the angelic sanctuary, the sacred space, the kingdom of the wife. But for many women, it wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap, and sometimes a prison. Because once you stepped inside, once the vows were said, and the world declared you a happy wife, your body, your voice, and your safety became subject to your husband's will. And if that will turned violent, too bad. Because in the eyes of the law, he was the authority, and you were the property. Physical abuse in marriage wasn't just tolerated. It was expected in some circles. A man had a right to discipline his wife, to correct her, to exert control. The old common law rule of thumb, that a man could beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb, yes, that was real and horrifyingly symbolic. Wives were warned not to provoke, not to question, not to speak too loudly, because if he raised his voice or his hand, Well, what did she do to deserve it? And where could you go? Not the police. If they even existed in your area, they'd politely tell you it was a domestic matter. Not the courts. Under coverture, you were not a legal person. You couldn't sue. You couldn't press charges. You couldn't even keep custody of your children if you tried to leave. Your husband was the legal head of the household, and what happened behind his door was his concern, not yours, not society's, and certainly not the government's. Emotional abuse wasn't even a concept. Controlling behavior, mockery, isolation, public humiliation, gaslighting, before we had the word for it. That was just marriage. You were told to be patient, to keep the peace, to pray harder, to not upset him when he was tired, or stressed, or drunk, or disappointed that dinner wasn't precisely how his mother made it in 1813. So what did women do? Some tried to run, only to be dragged back, legally or physically. Some endured in silence, deteriorating slowly behind smiles and social calls. But others wrote. Not letters, not complaints, diaries, hidden under floorboards, behind bricks, in false bottom trunks, tiny entries, slanted handwriting, rage whispered in ink. They couldn't speak aloud, but they could record. They could preserve the truth, just in case someday someone believed them. These diaries, fragments mostly, have surfaced over time. Some were found in attics, others inside old Bibles. One was discovered stuffed into the lining of a sewing box. They rarely used names, just pronouns. He came in late again. He shouted when the soup was cold. He threw the lamp. I pretended to faint. I do not know how to leave. I am afraid. Some entries end abruptly. We don't always know why. The abuse wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was the daily drip of cruelty, cutting off funds, forbidding visits, mocking appearances, scoffing at intelligence, praising other women, never you. It chipped away at identity, until a woman no longer recognized herself in the mirror. And still, she hosted tea. Still, she smiled for portraits. Still, she asked the butcher for the best cut and remembered to say thank you. Because Victorian society praised restraint, not resistance. If your marriage was violent, it was considered a private tragedy, not a public concern. And on the rare occasion a woman was believed, she was usually pitied, quietly, from a distance. But she was also tainted, damaged goods, unstable, perhaps a little dramatic. Women who tried to speak out were labeled as troubled, delicate, or worse, ungrateful. Ungrateful for the roof over their head, the name they carried, the meals provided by a man who sometimes forgot they were human. There were no shelters, no helplines, no exit plans. Even divorce, for most of the century, was virtually impossible for women, especially those without wealth, titles, or powerful family connections. You stayed, or you vanished, or you hoped the next bruise didn't leave a mark. This was domestic life for too many. A gilded cage, with thick walls, closed curtains, and a culture of silence so deep you could scream for years and never be heard. But the diaries remind us they were screaming, quietly, beautifully, terribly. They wrote their truth and hoped the ink would last longer than their voices. And in many cases, it did. Let's talk about the one subject Victorians couldn't stop whispering about, while simultaneously pretending it didn't exist. Pregnancy. You weren't supposed to mention it. You weren't supposed to acknowledge it. You definitely weren't supposed to be visibly happy about it. But you were absolutely supposed to achieve it, repeatedly. preferably within the first year of marriage, and ideally without looking sweaty or winded. Congratulations. You've entered the most high-stakes game of the Victorian household, pregnancy roulette. You see, in the Victorian era, getting married wasn't just about companionship or status. It was about continuation, of bloodlines, of estates, of names carved into the side of buildings nobody asked for. Your womb, that was prime real estate. Your job, to fill the nursery, often, quietly, with dignity. Preferably sons, no pressure. Now, of course, no one explained how to get pregnant. That would have required a level of honesty the Victorians were not emotionally equipped for. Women entered marriage with no knowledge of fertility, no access to modern health care, and a general sense that something would just happen once the vows were said and the awkward breathing began. And it often did, because there was no reliable birth control. Well, there were things that claimed to be. There were French letters, pessaries, withdrawal methods, and instructions that involve vinegar, sponges, and crossed fingers. But let's be honest, none of them were great, and so most women got pregnant, over and over and over again. The average Victorian mother might have 6 to 10 children. Some had more, some had fewer, often because of miscarriage, stillbirth, or maternal death. Because let's be very clear, pregnancy was dangerous. Prenatal care barely existed. You weren't seen by a doctor unless something was visibly wrong, or you had money and connections. Most births happened at home, often attended by a midwife who may or may not have had any training beyond her own experience and a strong stomach. Pain relief? Rare? Encouraged? Not really. Pain was considered virtuous, biblical, proof that you were doing your duty. Some women begged for chloroform during labor and were told no. Others simply screamed into the nearest handkerchief and hoped it would end soon. And when things went wrong, well, that was God's will. Hemorrhage, infection, breech birth, eclampsia, all common, all terrifying, all deeply misunderstood. Many women died during or after childbirth. Even more suffered long-term injuries, pelvic trauma, prolapse, fistulas. But these weren't discussed at dinner parties. You were expected to recover quietly, raise your children, and prepare to do it again within the year. And the pressure? Immense. If you failed to conceive quickly, you were pitied, whispered about, sent for tonics and rest cures. Because society assumed any fertility issue must be your fault. A bad constitution, weak blood, a uterus that needed to be toned or aligned. Your husband? Never the problem. Even if he was smoking 12 cigars a day, drinking mercury for his nerves, and barely present. Clearly the issue was you. And if you didn't want children, or wanted fewer, well, that was unthinkable. Motherhood was seen as a woman's highest calling. Refusing it, or even limiting it, was selfish, unpatriotic, and vaguely French. You were expected to glow, to sacrifice, to throw your whole being into motherhood with grace and enthusiasm, even if you just buried your third child and hadn't slept in 5 years. But here's the twist. Once you had those children, you didn't necessarily raise them, not directly, not fully. Upper-class families employed nannies, governesses, and nursemaids. You were still responsible for the big things, like naming them, dressing them in tiny sailor outfits, and making sure they didn't die of shame. But the day-to-day cuddles, messes, tantrums, and midnight fevers? Often delegated. That is, unless you were middle or working class. Then you had no help, no staff, no mercy, just a rotating cast of babies, toddlers, and judgment. And through it all, the danger never stopped. Because childbirth wasn't the end of risk. It was the beginning of a new one. Postpartum depression wasn't acknowledged. Melancholy might be noted, but mostly ignored. And maternal death from postnatal infection, childbed fever, claimed thousands. One dirty instrument, one unwashed hand. That's all it took. And yet, society continued to praise the Victorian mother as an ideal. Serene, tireless, and naturally fulfilled. Even as she mourned lost children, even as she feared the next pregnancy, even as she wrote diary entries like, "I dread the spring, I dread the silence," because she couldn't say aloud, "I am afraid of giving birth again." So, you've done your duty, you've become a wife, you've endured the bedroom, and now you're pregnant again. The neighbors are thrilled, the nursemaid is ready, and you're just praying this time it goes better than last. Because no one talks about how it went last time, not in front of the china. You've tried everything. You've smiled politely through the silence, endured the bedroom gymnastics, hosted dinner while suppressing existential dread, suffered the pregnancy roulette and the brothel side effects. You've read psalms by candlelight and hidden your diary under a floorboard. And now, finally, you've reached the breaking point. You want out. Which means you're ready to attempt the most difficult, shame-soaked, legally convoluted path a Victorian woman could take. Divorce. Spoiler, you probably won't get one. Let's start with the basics. Before 1857, divorce wasn't just rare. It was nearly impossible unless you were obscenely rich, and importantly, a man. You couldn't just go to court. You had to petition Parliament, yes, actual Parliament, to pass a special act dissolving your marriage. As in, the Right Honourable Lord Murgatroyd requests legal permission to stop pretending his wife isn't sleeping with the footman. It was expensive, public, embarrassing, and it was a privilege reserved almost exclusively for men. So what changed in 1857? The Matrimonial Causes Act, a radical reform that dragged marriage law out of the realm of royal favors and into actual courts. Now, for the first time, civilians could seek divorce through a legal process. Men could file on the grounds of adultery alone. Women, however, had to prove adultery plus something worse. Cruelty, incest, bestiality, bigamy, sodomy, or utter desertion. Just catching him in bed with the maid wasn't enough. You needed bruises, you needed witnesses, you needed documentation, and, ideally, a manservant who saw everything and was willing to testify while maintaining eye contact with a panel of Victorian judges. And oh yes, everyone would know, because divorce cases were public spectacle. Courtrooms were packed. Newspapers printed salacious transcripts. Your personal tragedies became public entertainment. Your dirty laundry was aired in the Times. Let's look at a real case. Mrs. Caroline Norton, a brilliant writer, socialite, and unfortunate wife of George Norton, a man who turned being a terrible husband into a full-time job. When Caroline left him after years of abuse, he retaliated by suing her for adultery, with the Prime Minister no less, ruining her reputation, and which, since she had no legal personhood, taking full custody of their children. She couldn't file for divorce. She couldn't reclaim her sons. She couldn't earn money in her own name. All because her husband, legally, was her. Carolyn eventually became a campaigner for women's rights, but not before suffering years of public humiliation and loss, simply for trying to escape. And she was one of the lucky ones. Other women were forced to prove cruelty in graphic, uncomfortable detail in front of an all-male court. Descriptions of beatings, forced intimacy, being locked in cellars or burned with irons, all laid bare. And even then, the judges might say, but did he mean to be cruel? Many women were told to go home, try harder, be more obedient, perhaps make his roast beef just the way he likes it. Because in Victorian society, marriage was for life, even if life was a slow daily horror show. And if you did get divorced, good luck recovering socially. Divorced women were often seen as morally suspect, emotionally unstable, dangerous to invite to dinner parties. They were too sad for married women and too scandalous for single men. You could be ostracized by neighbors, churches, even your own family. Employers might refuse to hire you. Friends might stop calling. The charity ladies might stop dropping off leftover biscuits. Because, in the eyes of the polite world, you had failed at the one thing women were supposed to be naturally good at: keeping a man calm, faithful, and clothed. Men fared better. A divorced man might be whispered about, sure, but not in the same way. He was a survivor, a widower of circumstance. He might remarry, start fresh, regain social standing. The woman, likely branded for life. Even custody was stacked against you. Until the late 19th century, fathers had automatic rights to the children, even if they were violent, unstable, or living with a mistress. A woman had no legal claim to her own offspring unless her husband allowed it. And if she left, she might never see them again. Some women stayed in abusive marriages for decades just to be near their children. Others escaped and spent the rest of their lives writing unanswered letters and tracing rumors about where their sons and daughters had been sent. So yes, divorce existed, technically, but for most women, it was a legal maze with no exit signs. You could try to navigate it. You could risk everything, but you might lose your home, your children, your name, your dignity, and even if you won, you still had to live with the whispers, the stares, the pitying looks over tea. Marriage, they said, was forever. What they didn't say was that for women, especially unhappy ones, forever could feel like a life sentence without parole. There's something in the tea tonight. No, really. It's tasteless, odorless, widely available, and tucked quietly inside the floral teacup of your neighborhood vicar's wife. Welcome to Victorian England, where arsenic was everywhere. In face powder, in rat poison, in wallpaper, and sometimes in your husband's mutton stew. Because when you give women no rights, no options, and no exit, some of them get creative. Arsenic was the Victorian era's answer to everything. Want clearer skin? Arsenic lotion. Want to kill bedbugs? Arsenic powder. Want green wallpaper that looks absolutely stunning in candlelight and slowly poisons everyone in the drawing room? Yes, arsenic-laced wallpaper was all the rage, and no one saw the problem until people started mysteriously dying mid-conversation. Even then, they blamed it on damp air. But cosmetics and decor aside, arsenic had another darker role in Victorian society. It became the weapon of choice for a certain type of frustrated wife, the kind who had no money, no legal recourse, and a husband who was just going to live forever, wasn't he? Enter the lady poisoner. She looked harmless. She was polite. She poured tea. She embroidered pillows. And sometimes she slowly, methodically murdered her spouse. Was it common? Not wildly. But it was common enough that it caught the public imagination like a match to lace. The mid to late 19th century saw a wave of poison panic, newspaper headlines gasping about murderesses in bonnets, deadly daughters of Eve, and the silent killer in the kitchen. The most terrifying part? You couldn't tell. There were no stab wounds, no broken doors. Just a man growing weaker, paler, more tired. Until one day he clutched his stomach after breakfast and dropped dead by dessert. Take Mary Ann Cotton, for example. She was calm, well-dressed, and possibly Britain's most prolific female serial killer. Between 1852 and 1872, she is suspected of poisoning up to 21 people, including 3 husbands, a lover, several children, and her own mother. Her motive? Insurance payouts. And possibly also the small matter of unbearable men. She used arsenic like some people use scented candles, regularly, quietly, and with lethal consistency. When she was finally caught and hanged in 1873, the public was shocked, but also fascinated, because she didn't look like a murderer. She looked like someone who'd ask if you wanted more jam. And that was the problem. Victorian society didn't know what to do with female criminals, especially ones who killed without blood or scandalous passion. Men stabbed, men dueled, men beat their wives or hired thugs. But women, they poisoned, silently, slowly, often with a gentle smile and a second cup of tea. The media didn't just cover these stories. They devoured them, serialized them, exaggerated them, turned them into morality tales with corsets and kitchen knives. Every woman became suspect. Every husband's stomach ache became a courtroom drama in waiting. Of course, not every death was murder. Some women were wrongfully accused, victims of bad science, bad luck, or simply existing near a dead man with digestive issues. Remember, arsenic was everywhere, in food, in dyes, in cleaning products. You could die from breathing too close to a fashionable drape. But once the panic started, nuance went out the window. Any woman with a dead husband and a mysterious past could be branded a Lady Macbeth. And the irony? Many of these women had no other option. Divorce was almost impossible. Domestic abuse was ignored. Legal protections didn't exist. And doctors rarely listened to women until they fainted or bled on something expensive. So for some, poison wasn't just an act of murder. It was an act of escape. A way out of a house that had become a prison. A life that felt like a sentence. A marriage where every day meant silence, shame, or worse. Not justifying it, just contextualizing it. The Victorian public, of course, saw things differently. They wanted monsters. They wanted villains in petticoats. They wanted to be shocked, but safely from a distance, with tea and biscuits. And so real women became tabloid cautionary tales. Fictionalized, demonized, forgotten. Except for the part where they were used to reinforce the same old message. See what happens when women get ideas? So tonight, if your tea tastes a little bitter, relax. It's probably just the wallpaper. Let's take a breath. You've spent the last 2.5 hours trudging through corsets, coverture, courtrooms, and arsenic. You've survived lace nightgowns, childbed fever, and the brothel problem. It's been grim. But here's the thing about Victorian marriage. It wasn't all horror. It was mostly horror, sure, but not all. Even within a structure designed to constrain, silence, and occasionally poison you, there were still flickers of something softer. Love, affection, resistance, hope. You just had to squint. Because yes, some Victorian couples actually liked each other. Not in a fireworks and slow dancing in the rain kind of way. This wasn't a Jane Austen adaptation. But they shared interests. They talked. They laughed. They sent each other letters that didn't begin with Sir and end with Your obedient servant. In fact, The late 1800s saw the rise of a new ideal, the companionate marriage. It was still rare, but it was catching on. The idea that a husband and wife might be companions, partners, intellectual equals. They might read books together. They might raise children as a team. They might, in whispered tones, discuss politics or philosophy, though not at the dinner table, of course. There were still standards. Love letters became a delicate art form. In the absence of actual freedom, words became rebellion. A single line. "I think of you when the light falls through the lace," could mean more than any public embrace. Men tucked locks of their wives' hair into pocket watches. Women pressed flower petals into folded pages. Some used coded language in case servants peeked. And if they were separated, they wrote and wrote and wrote. Long, achingly formal letters filled with longing, respect, and sometimes genuine emotional intimacy. Even in arranged or semi-arranged marriages, affection could bloom slowly, like ivy on stone. Some women described the first few years as awkward, even miserable. But then, something shifted. A shared grief, a successful harvest, a winter illness survived side by side. And suddenly, they were sitting on opposite sides of the hearth, sipping tea, occasionally finishing each other's sentences. No, it wasn't a sweeping romance, but it was companionship. And in a world built to suppress intimacy, that was radical. And what about resistance? It wasn't always loud, it wasn't always visible, but it was there. Some women subscribed to radical pamphlets under false names, periodicals promoting suffrage, education, bodily autonomy. Some pretended to be ordering linens and received Mary Wollstonecraft instead. Some passed around feminist poetry and recipe books. A few even wrote essays under male pseudonyms, because sometimes the only way to be heard was to be someone else entirely. There were also micro-rebellions, subtle but satisfying. Reading late at night when your husband said no candles. Teaching your daughters to question things. Refusing to pretend your son's every opinion was genius. Inviting the local widow to tea, even though everyone said she was strange. Resistance didn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it came with firmly brewed tea and a book you weren't supposed to own. Some women even found small communities of support. They wrote to one another. They formed reading circles. Some joined charitable committees that quietly doubled as safe spaces, places where women could speak freely about their husbands, their fears, and their dreams. It wasn't liberation, but it was connection. And in a society where most women were expected to suffer in silence, even that was revolutionary. And for all the bad husbands, there were some good ones. Men who genuinely loved their wives, who didn't raise their voices, who helped with the children, who encouraged their wives to read, think, speak. They weren't perfect. They were still products of their time. But they tried. And sometimes that trying made all the difference. So yes, the Victorian marriage was deeply flawed. It was legally stacked, emotionally restrictive, often physically dangerous. But inside that structure, some people found ways to connect, to communicate, to care. They sent letters, they pressed flowers, they whispered poems when no one was listening. They didn't change the system, not yet, but they cracked it, a little, and that crack, that small, quiet, ink-stained crack, was the beginning of something that would change. And here we are. You've survived Victorian marriage. You've been debuted, courted, wed, absorbed, exhausted, and, briefly, suspected of murder. You've managed household staff, endured lace-trimmed intimacy, and wept quietly into your embroidery. You've read radical pamphlets by lamplight and whispered through locked doors. You've made it through the arsenic panic without poisoning the jam. And now, you're in bed, you're safe, you're warm. And, unlike most Victorian brides, you can go to sleep tonight without worrying about the lead in your eyeliner or the syphilis in your husband's pocket watch. So, has anything really changed? The corsets are gone, mostly. The arsenic's off the market. You don't need your father's permission to marry, or a legal act of parliament to leave. And yet, the scripts still linger. The idea that a good woman must be agreeable. The pressure to smile, soothe, manage everything effortlessly. The whisper that marriage is the end goal, the prize, the proof you're worth something. We still carry pieces of that Victorian wallpaper, subtle, floral, full of expectations, pasted into the corners of our minds. But you made it, not just through this story, but through that story. The one that says love must look a certain way, sound a certain way, be dressed in lace and silence. You survived 1.5 hours of gaslight, ghostlight, and chamber pots. And now you get to rest. No curtsies required. This has been The Grumpy Historian. Sleep well, unless you dream in legal clauses and floral upholstery. And if you do, just fluff the pillow, pour another cup of imaginary tea, and remember, you are not trapped in the parlor anymore.